All right, welcome back, folks, for our second lecture. And today we're talking about theory and theoretical perspectives. And to sort of get ourselves going here, we're going to also recap and look at and re-examine a bit of what we discussed last week. And ultimately, the first week of our course of urban sociology was looking really at uh, uh, examining urban issues, but getting sort of hitting the ground running from that by looking at what ultimately urban sociology is and what it is not. And we generally understand that urban sociology is a framework for understanding complex cities. It's a framework that is sociologically based, but also within that, it is non judgmental. We do not rate cities or rank cities in terms of best or worst, least or most. We, again, our endeavor is to understand and to explain them and to explain their complexity, and also to within that, look at and examine social problems as they are evidenced within urban settings and urban areas. Within that, we also talked, if you will, about unique urban problems, particularly group separation, be that by class or race or gender. And so we'll look at that throughout the semester as well. And one example was the downtown construction, if you will, the way, the modality of that, and the layout of the newer downtown, the built environment within Los Angeles. Also, we looked at homelessness and that this master status, how it is often criminalized effectively by cities and urban regions as a way to, if you will, reduce the problem to criminality as opposed to an outcome of systemic, if you will, inequality within society. We also looked at the example and definition of environmental racism and using Hurricane Katrina as a backdrop within that sort of framework. The notion that really hurricanes are not truly if you will, natural disasters, that they are ultimately political and economic events as much as they are some sort of severe weather event. All right, so today we're going to talk about theory, largely theoretical paradigms and perspectives. And so we're going to look at ultimately how these apply to cities and how these apply within urban sociology. So we first have to talk about one of the major paradigms within sociology, urban ecology. Now, urban ecology, you could argue, was or is the initial paradigm for the initial beginning framework for looking at urban areas and cities. And so what it ultimately does is it studies how the city is an organism, a living organism with unique parts, different groups, subgroups, ethnic groups, cultural groups, neighborhoods, downtowns, business districts, and so forth, the business community, residences, homes, the religious and ecumenical community, and so forth. All of these parts come together to create a coherent whole within cities. And so each of these parts within itself has its own unique structure that's also connected to the other, again, parts that we mentioned and discussed. There are land use patterns as well as other ways the natural environment is utilized. So that these patterns establish and maintain order within the city as a sort of social organism. Relationships between the groups within the city itself are often shown and depicted spatially. Again, think about the case of the newer downtown portion of downtown Los Angeles. Populations going on within the city, again, different unique groupings and use, if you will, kinds of groupings and activities. They adapt to the city itself and then they compete for the territories they're in. So, again, a very spatial, connectedness oriented kind of way of looking at things. So, in a lot of respects, it looks at the kind of natural evolution of cities and what happens over time within cities between how the land is used, how the resources are used, and what it says ultimately about the relationships that exist within these environments. So those are some of its strengths, but again, all of these, if you will, theories, ways of looking at and viewing the world have their limitations. They have indeed their criticisms. One of the major ones for urban ecology is that there's little ability to truly explain the complexity of a lot of cities. One example of this is the Chicago School of Urban Sociology that I had hearkened to and mentioned last week. The Chicago School of Urban Sociology looked at cities in terms of how they evolved according to zones. Different kinds of use, values, and functions tended, if you will, to cluster in certain areas according to the zone way of looking at how cities and urban areas developed. And so the most famous of these is the concentric zone theory model by Ernest Burgess. And so toward the middle, you had your central business district. And then as you went further out, you had other kinds of zones. So Chicago was, again, for that Chicago school, the example that those sociologists at the University of Chicago used, that they felt, hey, it's happening here in Chicago, it must be happening everywhere. And so as they tried to apply the model to other places, it just really didn't hold water. So again, a lot of ecological ways of looking at cities are just not able to be applied uniformly to all cities. There is a de-emphasis of how much sharing goes on, and there's often much more overstating of the economic kinds of competitions that happen between groups, particularly in terms of how they use land and access the resources that are concentrated in urban areas. There's also a diminishing role of social structure. They tend to ignore how social structure actually happens and how it actually is part of the functioning of urban areas. All right, going on. There's, of course, another point of view. And so with that, we have to look at political economy. So this is a very different way of looking at cities, not just simply as natural organisms. And so what political economy reminds us of is that the major aspects of urban life are political and economic institutions. And so we're talking about the real estate market, we're talking about employment and jobs. We're also talking ultimately about politics and government. And so how these work together have a lot of impact on how cities function. And so cities ultimately reflect political, economic, and social arrangements of a given time. And going on, they're defined by how profit is pursued and how scarce resources are ultimately experienced, allocated, and distributed. Conflicts are inevitable, and so conflict is a key way of looking at what happens in cities according to this political economy paradigm. Conflicts shape the patterns that evolve within cities and the social life therein. Those who have power and privilege, they're in the position to arrange how cities function to best accommodate their needs and their values. How government functions, just period, regardless of who it tends to function for, is important ultimately to how a city actually works and is experienced. And then the economy and how the economy works, how the economy is structured, that is incredibly important as well, that cannot be understated. As much as there are indeed strengths that we've noted about this sort of way of looking at things, about how conflict is inevitable and we have to look at the patterns of that conflict, in a lot of respects, there can be an overemphasis of what happens politically and economically according to this paradigm. So there are some kinds of things that can be easily overlooked that, of course, often are picked up, if you will, in the human ecology school. The larger scale nature of this political economic view often doesn't look at some of the smaller group contexts that happen in the state of a city as well. And again, we talk about those small group experiences in sociology and small group interactions. We talk about them particularly in terms of symbolic interaction. Some of those ways of looking at cities have been used as well, but they perhaps are used to greater effect outside of urban sociology. So I know that that was a mouthful. I do have significant resources also provided for you for this week to dovetail with what I've said here in terms of how both of these schools of thought tend to look at society, particularly in terms of urban society and cities themselves. Um, so one thing we're going to come back to that we hearkened, or I should say we'll hearken back to, that we talked about in our discussion last week, was ultimately what's the difference between a good neighborhood and a bad neighborhood. And so we're going to get a chance to look at that and examine that again by looking at um, that question, if you will, from a great article by the sociologist John Logan of called, or I should say, termed Life and Death in the City, looking at neighborhoods in context. And so it's a way of looking at, well, not just how we feel about neighborhoods, but what ultimately brings that about, what brings about those emotions, what brings about those feelings, what brings about those assumptions that we often are led to make about what a good neighborhood is and can be versus another one. So I think you'll find that this adds a lot of additional context to what you had to say in your discussion posts. Um, Also, there's a really neat, really uh, neat in the sense that it's sort of hot off the press. That's what I mean by neat. It does cover some very, very significant, challenging current conditions that we have in cities. Looking at the case of New Rochelle, New York. The sociologists Lewis McCoy and Martinez worked on a great study of how COVID-19 developed and evolved in the suburb of New Rochelle, the suburb just north of New York City. It's a great analysis that looks at the political and economic factors that happen in cities and are ultimately related and tied to social groups and different power differentials that occur also within urban contexts. So that's another way for this week to get a good sense of how political economy theory would apply. The great thing about the Life and Death in the City article is that both of these schools of thought, ecology and political economy, are talked about and discussed at great length there as well. There are some additional resources about the Chicago School and about both ways of looking at cities theoretically that you can find this week as well. So, on that note, I bid you adieu, and we'll talk next week